Recollection 1. The View. Section 2. Winter was ending in the forests of Duran. Only 2 weeks remained until the last of the snow would disappear from the banks and trails of the forest. Much of the snow that remained was rather terrible. The piles that it was in were coarse and jagged things that could cut your bare hands if you fell into them, and some of them were quite deep. There were pockets in the forest where water flowed just in these odd days of the season that would freeze come the night. They hollowed out parts of the forest and shoved aside dirt and root with a slow ease. In the summertime, they were but odd craters in the forest floor that collected leaves and other fallen detritus. In the winter, however, they became unpredictable pitfalls that were either sure as an oak plank or would sink you down to your belly without a second thought for you. A bad step was hazardous enough to kill you. Life persisted nonetheless. The one grace that all the mud and the half-snow afforded was that they left the tracks of anything that trotted in the forest down long enough for anybody to see them. There was neither white snow nor green leaf. It was all a strange palette of muted earthen tones between the naked trees and withered ground and at times even the sky. Stealth was a luxury here that few were afforded. It meant that Patricia could hunt with ease, even if there was little to gather in the way of herbs and plants. Not even the insects could go without making a mark. Things like rabbits and deer that stood still as you crept closer were easy pickings in the forest. The stranger creatures, such as rock eels and snails, especially so, because their slime coats would freeze into a protective shell and render them immobile. Patricia knew every inch of the local forest intimately thanks to her time with the monastery. It was her playground. She flirted with danger and hope and darkness at every corner she turned. Her steps were wide and seamless. She hopped, skipped, jumped, and looked through every corner of the forest for something good to eat. She paused only for a brief moment to grab her way up a tree and scout the place before anything could see her. The air was cool and whistled gently into her ears. A woolen cloak she saved for colder days flowed behind her like the short cape of a hero. She spotted her game. A lonesome hare with a twitchy nose stepped cautiously around a patch of dead, sandy-colored grass. Patricia didn't even think. She simply pulled the cloak tight and leapt towards the hare. Patricia was quick, but her jump at the hare came up short. She smashed into the ground, and the hare bolted away from her with wild kicks that flung small speckles of mud into the air. Now the chase was on. She bounded towards the rabbit with reckless abandon. The rabbit leapt away, stopping and going once every 5 meters or so. She kept pace with the thing, attempting to tire it out, before it could slip away into some hole in the ground. Truth is, she was having fun with it. Cat and mouse with a rabbit was a great workout. It tested her reflexes, speed, and stamina all at once. She lost the hare just one time before snapping a dead branch from a tree loudly and scaring the poor thing out of its hiding spot. It darted over a clearing of snow and bolted off into the distance. Patricia thought this was her opening and sped after the creature. The third step she made into the snow, it collapsed under her weight. She fell down and took a hard landing in a meter of jagged, half-melted snow. Everything smarted something fierce. She crawled her way out of the pile of pain and up onto the dry roots of an old elm. Her pointed chin and modest nose were scuffed, as were her knees and elbows and breasts. A short break was in order. She thumped the back of her head against the tree behind her, and cursed the snow under her exhaled breath. After a brief rest, Patricia's footsteps rounded the snow trap to try and pick up on the rabbit's trail. The mud in front of the pitfall had quite the impression of the rabbit's tracks. Picking them up was child's play. Then again, that was part of what she loved about this sort of work. She trotted along the trail that the hare made in the muddy dirt of the forest floor. She started humming an old tune as she walked. On the sunny side of the street. It was a song that always made her think of her old home. It was special to her. Everybody in her old family knew it by heart. The soft winds of the forest whistled in tune, and the shadows around her danced a little luau as she came closer and closer to her prey. She spotted the hare in the distance, trying to look cute beneath some wheatgrass. For a second, she felt like she was in control. It was a good feeling. That feeling of control vanished when something else spooked the hare away. It saw or heard or felt something that Patricia didn't. That in turn scared her. She leapt up a nearby pine tree, minding the spines and the stray branches. She took her time surveying the area. There was a number of dangerous things in the forest. Wolves were not uncommon. Bears could be caught on occasion, as could ogres and goblins. A brown bear would be the worst-case scenario for Patricia's sake. She could scare away a troop of goblins. She could outrun an ogre. Wolves usually went away if you made enough noise, and weren't dumb enough to go attacking something that could kill them. A bear, though? A bear wouldn't scare easy for her. It would be fast enough to chase her down, and a bear would most definitely eat and kill her in that order. Claws and fangs and shaggy coats echoed a memory in her mind. She shuddered and felt for her right eye. Ever since she started having those terrible nightmares, she believed in the power of her dreams. They would leave her in a state of sleep so torturous and unbreakable that her body would wake before her mind would. She would walk about, wide-eyed yet unconscious, and scream at the top of her lungs at anything that moved or anybody who spoke to her. The High Sisters and Brothers of the monastery called these advanced sort of nightmares night terrors. Trouble is that Patricia couldn't pick out if this sensation was a memory of a real event or a night terror she had endured. Her head hurt just thinking about it. It wasn't her most recent one, though. In her most recent terror, she fell beneath the earth to the underscore itself, the layer of the corpses and the dead. There, she met a hydra, flanked by a demon with a sword. She tried to tell herself it was all just a dream. That's often what she would tell herself. Whether she actually believed that or not was another matter. Patricia stayed in the tree for a moment longer. She breathed deeply, feeling into and through the tree, smelling the crisp, cool air and hearing the rustling of the trees on the soft wind. For the life of her, she couldn't sense whatever danger the hair did. As far as she could tell, there was no danger. With slow and sure footing, she descended the tree. She took a short hop to the ground below, landing in a sort of crouched position. That's when she saw it in the mud. There were hominid footprints in the ground. They were small and hatched sideways like a proper pair of shoes. What's more, they were fresh in the mud. Someone else was out here. Patricia followed the footprints for curiosity's sake. She made a mental checklist of all the things it could and couldn't be. Elven feet were dainty, sure, but they weren't small like these tracks were. Merfolk, Minotaur, and Elmdar didn't wear shoes. Merfolk had fins, and the Elmdar and Minotaur hooves. A Voloth would have left an additional trail with their scaly tails, and were a bit more heavy-set than to leave prints as shallow as this. A Kitsune or Tengu was unlikely. You didn't tend to find the fox and bird folk in Duran. Not impossible, but improbable. Okami have paws, and were even less likely to be seen. That boiled things down to these either being fairy tracks or goblin tracks. There was a problem even with that deduction, though. Fairy were tiny. They flew with lepidopteran wings and seldom touched the ground, save to sleep or maintain themselves. Goblins just didn't wear shoes. It could have been that these were a child's tracks she was seeing, but there were no other tracks besides it. How would a lone child have made it out this far into the woods? Who would let a lone child wander this far out? How much farther? A tired little voice rang through the forest. Patricia didn't even see her. She quickly ducked behind a tree and waited for whoever let their voice slip. To her surprise, a small, 90-centimeter figure rounded the corner. She was a full meter tall if you counted her large, pointy, leather Scottish cap on her head. A faded blue poncho obscured the long skirt and thick stockings of a schoolgirl's uniform. She wore black buckled shoes and had a backpack clumsily slung onto her shoulders. Auburn hair in a bob, tawny eyes and pale skin drafted an innocence about her. She couldn't have been more than 9 years old. Wait, who was she talking to? But we've been walking forever! Auntie, my feet hurt, the little girl whined. Auntie? There was nobody else around her, from what Patricia could see. She was walking alone. A little girl walking this far into the woods alone and talking aloud to an absent figure. That spelled mystery and danger in this land of monsters and magic. Patricia was cautious, yet curious.
"He can hear us?"
The little girl blurted. Patricia took a sharp breath in.
"What do you mean we're being watched?"
The little girl questioned nobody. The girl turned in Patricia's direction. She hardly had enough time to duck behind the tree. How did she know she was there? Patricia had to make a move, and fast. Her inclination was a cruel one. There were old tales of what happened to little girls who got lost in the woods. She was going to parody those, and teach this little one a lesson. Patricia drew up the hood to her cloak and wore it low over her brow. She ruffled up the edges to give it a more sinister impression. She gathered phlegm in her throat to make her voice a bit more raspy. She let out her best witch hag's cackle into the forest around her. She could hear the little girl freeze in place. She rounded the tree slowly with an accentuated hump in her back.
"Little girls,"
Patricia rasped.
"Been long since we sees them. Been long since we..."
She peeked up from the hood just a little bit to make sure the little girl was paying attention.
"Eats them."
The little girl shivered and tapped the tips of her fingers together nervously. She was white as a sheet from Patricia's performance. Patricia dropped the hood and cut the act quickly, letting out a boisterous, breathy laugh that echoed through the woods. She did her job quite well. It looked like she'd scared the pants off the little one. Clearly the little girl didn't find the whole thing as funny as she did. "Relax, kid. I'm not actually going to eat you." Patricia calmed down.
"Ah! Cannibals! Ah!"
The little girl shrieked. "Ow, my ears!" Patricia winced at the girl's voice. She just screamed and turned tail.
"People eaters!"
she shouted. "Hey, wait! I said I wasn't going to eat you!" Patricia started. She recovered fast, but the little stray was already darting away. Patricia shouted after the child as she sprung off into the forest. Fuck, Patricia thought to herself. It was one thing if she was eaten by a bear. Patricia would never let it down if she let a pup like this die out here. Though the little one was clearly full of energy and got a head start on her, Patricia was the faster of the two. She gained on the child as they both weaved through the forest, but whenever she was about to catch up, the kid would slip just that little bit farther away. It was like she had eyes in the back of her head telling her where Patricia was. The kid almost fell over as she darted atop a pile of half-melted snow. Patricia couldn't tell whether or not it was going to be deep or shallow. She learned her lesson last time, though. The trees were narrow and close enough to each other. Instead of crossing the snow, she ran up the sides of the trees, kicking off their bodies and swinging from their branches in a spectacular fashion, until she landed at last on the far side of the snowbank. The child turned and took notice of this with a gasp and kept running.
"Come on! Seriously! I'm not going to hurt you, but there's stuff in this forest that will!"
Patricia said to the kid as they ran.
"Go away! Auntie! Help me!"
The girl shrieked.
"Auntie?"
Patricia questioned.
"Auntie who?"
A branch flung itself from a tree right at head level before she could finish the thought. While the child ran safely underneath, Patricia was hit square in the face by a length of mulberry. Her feet left the ground and she landed on her back with a thump. She quickly sat back up and spat leaves out of her mouth. The child's hat shifted as she ran further into the distance. Now she remembered why that hat was of note. There were only two kinds of people who wore a Scottish cap. Its conical shape is meant to grip the head in a way that stimulates thought. It's given to delinquents to help them focus. It is worn by wizards and witches for the same reason. The kid must have been magical. That made a bit more sense to her. She would have pondered what the sprout meant by auntie, but she was angry with the kid now. She'd probably been using illusions on her. That irked her fearsomely. Patricia narrowed her focus as she stood up. She might just go back on her word not to hurt her if she sees the kid chanting something. Nonetheless, Patricia took the stance of a track runner in the forest. She watched carefully as the kid ran over another patch of snow. She picked up a small stone and hurled it in her direction. It struck the snow and the whole thing cascaded downward a solid 20 centimeters. The kid didn't trip, but her legs were caught. Patricia sprinted after the runt, game to snatch the hat right off of her head and see what magic she'd use to get it back. The kid struggled and squirmed as she closed the distance, her tiny legs crunching the melt underfoot. Patricia skipped her way over the melt just as she had done before, and was only a few meters from the kid now. The child freed herself from the ice just as Patricia's hand threatened her cap. There was a sudden crunch from the ground they were running on. Just before Patricia could get her hands on the kid, the child fell down into the ground through a surprise hole that was covered by forest leavings and thin ice. Patricia cursed under her breath as she slowed to a trot. She went carefully to investigate the hole when her foot sunk into the ground. She wiggled her foot around. There wasn't anything underneath it. She panicked and tore her foot away from the ground. This only made the hole under her larger. Patricia fell suddenly, cursing the ground as she did. Patricia slid down into a deep, dank chasm where the only light was what was coming from that hole she made overhead. The place was porous and earthy. The sedimentary stones of the walls looked like sponges in color and texture. A soft dripping noise, likely from some melting snow somewhere, sounded the narrow halls of this place. Strange, long veins of rock laid themselves at odd angles in the cave. It was a less than ideal location to land in. Patricia was unharmed from the fall. She stood up and rubbed her backside. It was wet, goddammit. There was debris from the fall around her. She took a few tentative steps into the darkness of the cave. She couldn't tell which way was north from here. She racked her brain trying to figure out what direction the hole the kid fell into was. The cave led in either direction. It was a 50-50 chance of heading the right way, provided she fell into the same bizarre system of caves Patricia was in. She took a moment to think about it, and then she turned and started walking the opposite of where she was going to go. She knew she had terrible luck with these sorts of things. She always kept a map because of her terrible sense of direction. That lot of good it did her in here. So she went farther down into the cave. It got more and more narrow as she went, eventually segmenting into many small tubes that were unreasonable to fit through. She cursed aloud again. She was about to go the right way and had turned herself about. She hated it when that happened. Patricia doubled back through the cave, coming to a large room in the place where she could hear the sounds of a struggle. There were 3 other halls to this strange, wet cave. She didn't have to guess to discern which way the child's cries were coming from. Sounds seemed to travel easily through this place. Patricia followed the echoes through the tunnels and saw the child down the halls. She was wreathed in pale light from the hole she had made above. A curious leather-bound tome was laying within her arm's reach. It had a ruby the size of a mouse in its cover. The kid was struggling to get her foot out of the rubble she had made. Patricia's approach was slow, so as not to startle her more. "Hey, kid. You all right?" Patricia asked, bringing herself into view with her hands up.
Ah! People eater!
The kid shouted, pulling the strange book closer to herself. Patricia sighed. "For the last time, I'm not actually gonna eat you."
But you said you would,"
the kid murmured, hiding behind her book. It was a prank. A cruel joke, maybe, but only a joke. You ever been part of a prank before? Patricia asked.
"You're mean! Go away!"
The kid cried. Patricia pursed her lips. "Fine. I guess I could just leave you here."
"What?"
the kid exclaimed. Patricia turned around. "Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be eaten by whatever lives here. It's cold, dark, and slimy in here. I don't want to be here for longer than I have to," she teased. "I was gonna free you, but if you really want me to go, I guess I have no other option." She took a step forward. The kid started and stopped Patricia's advance.
Was that a prank too?"
Patricia turned back to her. "Sharp kid. That's called sarcasm. It's like a prank, but you're only using your words." She crouched to meet the child's eyes. "My name's Patricia. What's yours?"
"Monster!"
the kid shouted, seemingly pointing at Patricia's face. "Whoa, relax. I said I'm not going to hurt you." Patricia defended. "No! Behind you!" the kid said. Patricia's ears registered a hissing noise seconds before a pair of slimy jaws made their way for her head. Had she not moved her body as she turned to meet it, the thing would have snapped right into the back of her head. It was tough to see in the darkness, but it looked like a rock eel was draping itself from the ceiling. It was a good thing Patricia's lessons at the monastery involved avoiding sudden strikes like that, or it might have bit into her brains. The rock eel hissed at her as more of its form slipped out of the ceiling. Where was it coming from? The camo-patterned creepy crawly undulated rhythmically. Patricia quickly took off her gloves and put her arms up to fight the thing. She steadied her breathing as the two eyed each other. She was definitely fast enough to match the thing, and in spite of the rock eel's tendency to lunge, they had soft skulls that yielded easily to the touch. The problem was landing a hit. She started throwing punches as the creature weaved around. The rock eel wormed its way around her strikes and snapped back at her. Being just as swift as it was, Patricia evaded the nips the rock eel took at her. Patricia didn't have time for these games. The longer she was in the fight, the more likely she was to get bitten. Naturally, she didn't want that. She cracked her knuckles onto the soft body of the eel. Its rubbery flesh was able to absorb the blunt impact of her hard fist, but her fists were more than just bludgeons. Her powers had an effect on the slimy skin of the rock eel. They froze whatever they touched, and the eel's skin was no exception. The place she struck hardened into a shell-like plate with the consistency of hard candy. The eel whined as it writhed back from the blow and snapped at Patricia. Again it missed, but its lips touched the side of her arm. She had to turn things up a notch if she and the kid were going to survive this. Patricia rang out into the cave as she pummeled the rock eel with an overwhelming flurry of blows that were too numerous and fast for it to avoid. In a single second, she'd thrown 12 punches at the rock eel. Every one of them was a hit. The rock eel's skin solidified before her very eyes. It appeared to become a stalactite in the ceiling as it froze. Patricia breathed easily, but got the strangest sense of déjà vu. Patricia turned to the child and tore away at the debris trapping her leg. She reached for Patricia's hand to help herself up, but not wanting to hurt the child, she gave her the arm instead. The kid held on as Patricia yanked her up off the ground and set her on her feet. She was surprisingly light. There was a crack from behind them. The rock eel was starting to free itself. "Let's get out of here," Patricia rambled. The two of them fled down the tunnel back to the main room of the cave. The child started for the cavern that Patricia had come from, but she quickly put her hand on the child's cap to stop her. An unexpected "ow" came from nowhere as Patricia pulled the kid back and rattled, "Not that way! This way!" It was another 50-50 down 2 stone tunnels, and once again Patricia's luck was sour. They came to another room. It was different from the rest of the place. It was smoother, made from a more solid stone that was rigid with the impressions of bodies. In the center of this room was a large greenstone aperture. It was weathered and crumbling. Patricia wasn't sure how old it was, nor did she much care in that moment. There were no other exits in that room, just some ruins and more of those curious stones scattered about. It wasn't until she heard one of them cracking that Patricia understood exactly what this place was. Rock eel slime froze into an edible shell that protected them during the days of winter. That's why they were called rock eels. Those days were ending. Those weren't veins of rocks she had seen earlier. Those were hibernating rock eels. This place was a rock eel lair. Patricia spun around and put her hands up to defend herself as 3 rock eels slithered out of their shells and accosted her and the child. Their hungry lips flicked out a devil's tongue from behind glassy teeth at the two of them. She swore on her life that she wouldn't let the kid die this way. They edged closer, slick bodies moving almost soundlessly on the smooth floor. Each of them scanned her and the kid with their beady eyes. There was an unsettling intelligence behind them. 2 of the beasts leapt for Patricia's legs. She started backwards and jumped over them when they hit the ground in front of her. Patricia threw punches at the last one standing, but its tricky movements kept her from getting a good hit in. Patricia was about to turn up the heat when she was flanked by the duo of rock eels that had attempted her legs just now. She managed to dance the strike of the first, but the second one grabbed onto Patricia's calf and bit down with its glassy fangs. Patricia shrieked as it seized her leg. She whipped the eel at its fellow with a strong kick that tore it from her leg. The rock eel on her leg slammed into the one she'd tried to punch, fresh human blood dripping off of its mouth. Patricia limped back from the 3 eels. She'd torn her leg open, but the eel hadn't taken a chunk of flesh out of her. With that, though, she'd lost the speed game. She could feel that she wasn't going to be as fast with a wounded leg like that. Patricia stood her ground as the 3 rock eels eyed the best way to disassemble her. But the fight was hardly the focus of the child she was defending. Instead, the pup seemed entranced by the arching round of the stone ruins. She eyed them up as Patricia fought for their lives. Something about it called to her. Something made her reach out to it. She felt the ruins with her bare hands. She spoke in a language neither of them understood. Patricia turned to her just in time to see her put her hand to it. She recognized what that ruin was. "Don't touch that!" Patricia shouted too late. All at once, energy sparked from the aperture as the strange carvings within it lit up with a glorious light, and a portal like melon puree opened in the center of the thing. Even the rock eels were entranced, with the whirling suction of the weird warp in space. The book the child carried fell out of her arms and flopped to the floor, springing itself open and fluttering its pages. A ghostly howl echoed through the entire cave, shaking the place to its core. A paw, black and speckled as the night sky, stepped forth from the portal. There was an imprint on the thing. It was like a wolf or a dog, but it was a few times larger than anything normal. It seemed to struggle against the film of the portal itself. It tore free with sticky, thick strands of the portal clutching to its night sky fur like paint to a black canvas. It smelled like blood and electrical burns. Its eyes were red like hot coals, and it flicked a tail that ended in a long, bulbous spine about itself to shave off what bits of the portal it couldn't shake from its person. The light and magic of the portal ended in a flash, leaving everybody dazed with only the red of the beast's eyes to light the room. "Sweet cinnamon! A black dog!" Patricia shouted. Patricia followed its eyes as they moved to where the little girl was in the darkness of the cave. Her own eyes couldn't set back fast enough to see what was happening. She'd feared the worst, but she could feel the power coming off of this creature. It would be suicide to fight it. Then, an unusual voice boomed in the chamber. Somehow, she just knew that gravel in the air was the voice of the beast. "I am Garmer of the Underscore. I name thee Master, Book-bearer." The black dog spoke.
Auntie, help!"
The child bleated. "I will aid thee, Book-bearer, for thou hast called me to thy side," Garmer said.
Okay, eat the monsters!"
The child ordered. "Very well," Garmer bellowed. Patricia's eyes were still adjusting, but she could make out the outline of the creature shifting to face the rock eels. It growled lowly at the rock eels, who in turn hissed and flared their orange gills at the black dog. She turned to face the eels as well. Perhaps this dog was a boon of the girl's magic. Now it was a fair fight. The black dog Garmer leapt into action. It took the eel that bloodied Patricia in its jaws and thrashed it about like it was a chew toy. Patricia was close behind it and boxed the other 2 rock eels. She'd managed hits on both of them, though how severe she couldn't tell. Her eyes were still coming to light. Because of this, avoiding the eels was that much more difficult. She felt a whoosh of air as one of them skirted her midsection. She felt a bite like a vice made of broken glass take hold of her left arm from the other. Garmer was finishing up with the one eel. It threw it up against the ceiling and then swallowed the creature whole. Patricia didn't have time to awe at the mouth of Garmer. She had bigger fish to fry. She ducked a lunge from the other eel that sailed it over her head. At the same time, she held her hand to the face of the eel biting down on her arm. A shell came over its head as it froze in place, Patricia drove her free fist through that shell and into the soft head of the rock eel on her arm. It let go of her and slumped to the ground limp as a wet noodle. Now Patricia and the black dog stared down the last rock eel in the room. It hissed and flared and nipped at the two of them as if to say, "Back off." Patricia and Garmer walked around the rock eel to opposite sides. The rock eel curled up and kept hissing at them until it lunged at Garmer with all the force it had. It missed its mark, and the quick Patricia caught its tail before it hit the ground. She swung the eel about herself. Round and round and round it went, until the part of its tail that was solidified from her powers separated from the rest of it with a fleshy ka-schlick. The eel flew all of 2 meters, where its head was caught in the jaws of the black dog and crushed to atoms like a watermelon beneath a sledgehammer. The battle was won by Patricia and the dog. Her eyes had finally gotten used to the darkness again. Against the dark backdrop, the black dog Garmer looked blue. Its fur glistened as if it contained stardust or glitter. The dog swallowed up both of the rock eel corpses like a hungry man slurping down a bowl of noodles. The sight and noise was repulsive, but it was better than being eaten by the thing herself. The child took a few cautious steps over to the black dog. Garmer yawned and licked its lips, lowering its head in a gesture like a knight to a princess. The child tentatively put out her hand and patted the dog on its head. Garmer endured. Her petting got more and more ferocious until she was eventually stroking away tufts of its midnight fur. Patricia couldn't help but smile at this. "Am I a good dog?" Garmer asked.
You're a good doggy.
The girl chimed. "Should you ever have need of me, I will rest in thy tomb," Garmer said. "Please be safe." The girl's book opened back up with a start, and a vortex came out of it that inhaled the black dog before the book shut itself tight with a rumble. Patricia walked over to it alongside the girl, who cautiously picked it up and held it close to her chest. Her cap shifted a tick, and she became more alert in that instant. She jerked over to Patricia. She knew that look in her eyes. She was expecting a fist. Patricia poker-faced and looked over her plainly. Any explanation at all?" Patricia asked.
No.
The girl shook her head. "All right, then," Patricia sighed, placing her hands on her hips and looking away. "We'll talk about all this once we're out of here. Want to find the exit with me?"
Okay.
The girl nodded. They set off back down the melty sandstone halls of this strange place one final time, hoping not to run into any more rock eels. In retrospect, it was perhaps wishful thinking. Just as they were about to round into the final tunnel, another rock eel dropped down and almost snatched the hat right off of the kid's head. Patricia was quick and snagged her collar from the back before the creature could lash out at her. Patricia put her fists up as it hissed. She felt a tug at her cloak. The kid babbled something about monsters being behind them. From the chamber with the portal came one. 3 more came from the tunnel Patricia had started in. A final rock eel slithered from the tunnel the kid was trapped in. Nursing a bruise, it started a chorus of vile hissing with its cohort. The curved, glassy teeth of the eels glistened like the edges of razor blades in the darkness. They were surrounded. It was one thing for Patricia to take on a rock eel on her lonesome, and she'd only faced the 3 because she had to. 6 angry rock eels was out of the question. They would tear both of them limb from limb worse than wild dogs. Unless... Now would be a good time to bring out that dog. Patricia's voice shook. The child flipped through the pages of the book clumsily. "I don't know how!" she shouted. "You don't know how? I thought you were a mage," Patricia gesticulated.
I don't know everything yet.
The kid shook with a panic. The one within the presumed exit hissed loudly and shut up the rest of its screeching fellows. It curled up to strike them. Patricia put herself between the kid and the eels. She prayed for a miracle. The eel leapt at them. He was split apart by some unseen force. 2 halves of the eel landed on either side of Patricia and the kid. The 2 were hosed with the thick, stinky blood of the rock eel. Its cohort looked around in confusion. There was a noise like the shutter of a camera, but it was 10 times louder than normal. A blade flashed in the darkness. Within an instant, all 5 of the eels were headless, writhing masses, spurting blood all over the place. A warrior stood behind the headless stumps of the eels and brandished a blade of ungodly size as they all fell to the ground. What the hell just happened? Patricia thought to herself. The warrior had just destroyed 6 rock eels in the blink of an eye. It was impressive, bordering on fearsome, by any standard. The warrior flipped her off-white hair about her face and her Brobdingnagian sword onto a sheath slung loosely around her back. She was of pale skin, almost ghostly, and her hair threatened the border between blonde and platinum with the barest hint of curls at its ends. A nose like a thumbtack sandwiched large, quincy yellow eyes between thin eyebrows. She was lean and young, clearly a teenage girl of a loose 16 years. Her coat was snowy and cut at the knees and elbows, with comically large purple buttons and pockets you could fit a bowling ball inside. Her shorts were too short, and were paired with a lone button-down and little else, not that there was much for her to show. Where in this day and age does one get tennis shoes like hers? The strangest thing about this otherworldly girl was her sword. There was no logical way someone of her build should have been able to wield it. The blade of that bastard was easily as thick as Patricia's thumb. It was at least 30 centimeters wide, and if the blade alone were stood next to Patricia's body, it would prove taller than she was. The guard was a stout golden thing above the handle, which itself was also an incredible 90 centimeters, and had a crescent hilt that rounded toward the blade like the anchor of a ship. This woman was impossible. Huh. That was easy, the woman chirped.
My hero!
The kid swooned, hugging the sword-wielding woman. Thanks, Patricia said to the woman. Whatever. Is there any good loot here? The woman asked. What? Patricia shook her head.
Fat loot, my dude. Is it here?
The woman urged, stepping into Patricia's bubble.
My name is Kara. What's yours?
The kid asked, tugging on the warrior's jacket. Buzz off, ankle-biter, the warrior woman spat.
I have gold,
Kara chirped.
My name's Ayano.
The warrior's tone shifted.
Happy to save your kickable ass. Now about that gold. Here you go.
Kara flipped a gold coin into the air with her thumb, and the warrior Ayano caught it in her teeth before spitting it out into her hand, to the applause of the pup. What's that? Ayano asked, motioning her head to Patricia. Patricia was offended. And interrupted.
That's Patricia,
Kara chirped.
She eats people.
What? No, I don't! Patricia stopped.
Kept saying you'd eat me.
Kara shrugged.
It was one time and it was a joke.
Patricia defended herself.
Shitty joke, dude,
Ayano commented. Do I look like a dude to you? Patricia's anger rose. Ayano scanned her in the dark. Yeah. Patricia ground her teeth. Fine, she barked. I'm going back to the monastery.
Monastery?
A monastery sounds fun.
There's probably a ton of loot in there,
Ayano sang. Patricia looked at her like she grew an extra head and waved her finger. You are not looting my monastery. There wouldn't even be that much. Monks like me don't make a lot of cash.
Church isn't taxed, and people just leave their stuff at shrines. I'm sure I'll find something,
Ayano said. Patricia was starting to wish she was eaten.
Auntie told me to find the monastery. Could you show it to me? Please?
Kara asked sweetly. Auntie? Ayano questioned. She's got a familiar in her hat, Patricia told her.
What?
Kara gripped the wide brim of her hat.
No, I don't. There's nothing in my hat.
Sure, kiddo. Patricia smiled shortly before snatching the cap with a jab.
Hey!
Kara protested. Now let's see here. Patricia peered into the hat, and a curious Ayano did too. The inside of it was barren and plain. Liar! Ayano knit her brow at Patricia. But I swear to Khaki I heard her talking to it, Patricia claimed.
Who's Khaki?
Ayano and Kara asked at the same time. Patricia paused for breath. Okay, follow me. I'm gonna blow your little minds. Patricia and Garmer walked around the walk eel.
Walked around the walk eel? Silly wabbit.